The Grand Pinium Survival Academy was not a place for the faint of heart, or for species who possessed a heart in the first place. It was the absolute zenith of hardship training, a crucible designed to smelt the galaxy's finest strategists, soldiers, and first-contact specialists into something harder, sharper, and far more cynical. The Academy floated in the upper atmosphere of a gas giant, a collection of sterile white platforms and shimmering energy fields that looked less like a school and more like a cosmic garage sale of anxiety. For its students, the final examination was the stuff of legends, a 30-day ordeal on a designated Class 4 hazard world. Class 4 was the kind of classification that made insurance actuaries develop nervous tics. It meant the fauna was actively, creatively hostile, the flora was probably poisonous and vaguely sentient, and the weather had homicidal intentions. To pass, a cadet had to do one simple thing: survive for 30 days and activate a rescue beacon at a predetermined location. Simple. Among this year's final trio of examinees, confidence was, for the most part, soaring. First, there was Kthar of the Xyloch. He was a magnificent, terrifying specimen of bipedal insectoid biology. Standing a full 3 meters tall, his body was a fortress of overlapping chitinous plates the color of obsidian. 6 powerful limbs, 2 for locomotion and 4 for exquisite, calculated violence, ended in claws that could shear through plasteel. The Xyloch were a warrior race, a people for whom every interaction was a form of combat, and every problem was a nail to be met with the hammer of their physical prowess. Kthar saw the 30-day trial not as a challenge of survival, but as a 30-day buffet interspersed with opportunities for glorious battle. He had sharpened his foreclaws on the shuttle ride down, a grating sound that set the other passengers' nerves on edge. Then, there was Zorlax of the Glim. Zorlax was Kthar's diametric opposite. It was a being of pure intellect, a crystalline consciousness that floated a meter above the ground, held aloft by its own subtle gravitic field. Its body was a complex lattice of glowing blue facets that chimed and resonated as it processed information. The Glim had long ago abandoned messy organic forms for the purity of crystalline thought. They perceived the universe as a grand equation, a series of logical propositions that could be solved with sufficient data and processing power. Zorlax had already calculated the planet's atmospheric composition, probable tectonic activity, and the statistical likelihood of encountering predators over 400 kilograms. To Zorlax, survival was not a matter of strength, but of superior information management. The planet was simply an open-book test. And then there was the human. His name was Jake. Galactic consensus on humanity was, to put it charitably, mixed. They were a relatively new species on the interstellar stage, and their initial impression had been underwhelming. They were soft, squishy bipeds with no natural armor, no claws, no venom, and a distressingly fragile skeletal structure. Their senses were mediocre, their strength was laughable compared to a Xyloch, and their intelligence, while adaptable, seemed to lack the focused, crystalline purity of a Glim. They were, in the grand, savage tapestry of the galaxy, considered prey. They were pack animals, it was conceded, clever enough in large groups, but individually, they were about as threatening as a damp towel. Jake did little to dispel this notion. He was of average height for his species, with a mop of brown hair that refused to be tamed and a face that seemed permanently etched with a look of mild, pleasant curiosity. While Kthar exuded menace and Zorlax radiated intellectual superiority, Jake exuded the faint, unassuming aura of someone who might ask you for directions. He had boarded the transport shuttle wearing the standard-issue survival suit, which seemed to hang off his frame, and carrying a small, lumpy bag. "Trail mix?" he had offered, holding the open bag out to Kthar. "It's a custom blend. Got raisins, nuts, and little chocolate bits." Kthar had simply stared at him, his multifaceted eyes unblinking. The offer of sharing food, a resource to be hoarded and protected, was so bafflingly foolish that it didn't even register as an insult. He had dismissed the human with a chittering sound of contempt. Zorlax, for its part, had analyzed the chemical composition of the trail mix via a remote spectral scan and deemed it nutritionally inefficient. It emitted a low, dismissive hum, the Glim equivalent of a sigh. And so, The trio was deposited onto the surface of Xylos Beta. The instructor's final words, broadcast from the ascending dropship, echoed in their comms. 30 days. Find the beacon. Try not to get eaten. Academy out. The landscape of Xylos Beta was a masterpiece of threatening ambience. Jagged purple rocks clawed at a sky the color of a fresh bruise. The air tasted of ozone and regret. Strange, multi-limbed creatures skittered in the shadows, and the trees, which looked like gnarled, skeletal hands, seemed to whisper malevolent advice on the wind. Kthar slammed a fist into his palm, a gesture that cracked the very air. A glorious hunt awaits. The planet will provide all the sustenance I require. Zorlax drifted serenely, its facets glowing as it cross-referenced its internal star charts with the local constellations to triangulate their position. The optimal path to the beacon coordinates is 147 degrees north by northwest. Probability of encountering a territorial alpha predator on this route is 674%. An acceptable risk. Jake just stood there for a moment, head tilted, looking at the grim, alien sky. He took a deep, deliberate sniff of the air. Then he smiled. It was not a smile of arrogance or bloodlust. It was a gentle, almost nostalgic smile. Huh, he said to no one in particular. Smells a little like Arizona after a rainstorm. Kthar and Zorlax ignored him. The weakling was already lost in some soft-skinned delusion. This planet would break him in a day. They were sure of it. The next 29 days were a testament to the respective strengths of the Xyloc and the Glim. Kthar, true to his word, hunted. He wrestled massive, six-legged grazers to the ground, cracked open their armored shells, and feasted. He was a force of nature, a whirlwind of claws and fury that met the planet's hostility with his own. Zorlax, meanwhile, navigated. It identified edible fungi by their spore patterns, located subterranean springs through seismic resonance, and plotted their course with unerring, logical precision. It conserved energy, avoided unnecessary conflict, and treated the entire experience as a complex, multivariable puzzle. And Jake? Well, Jake tagged along. He didn't seem to do much of anything, really. He walked where Zorlax told him to walk. He ate the scraps of meat Kthar deigned to leave for him, cooking them over a small, neat fire he insisted on making every night, much to Kthar's disgust. Real warriors ate their kills raw. He spent an inordinate amount of time just looking at things. He'd squat by a stream, watching the flow of the water. He'd poke at the soil with a stick. He'd spend an hour observing the flight patterns of a small, buzzing insect. The primate is cataloging its new cage. Zorlax had resonated to Kthar one evening. It is a common behavior in captured lesser species. They seek to understand the boundaries of their confinement. It is weak, Kthar had rumbled back, tearing into a haunch of something reptilian. Its softness is an insult to the very concept of survival. When we reach the beacon, I shall recommend the Academy bar his entire species from future enrollment. On the 30th day, they crested a ridge of shattered obsidian and saw it. The beacon. It was a standard-issue Class G long-range distress unit, a 15-foot spire of polished alloy designed to be visible from orbit. It stood in the center of a small, dusty crater. The end was in sight. Zorlax's internal chronometer confirmed they were 3 hours ahead of schedule. A perfect execution. Kthar let out a triumphant roar that sent pebbles skittering down the ridge. Even he was ready for a proper nutrient-paste dispenser and a zero-gravity sparring session. They approached the beacon with a sense of weary accomplishment. Kthar placed a clawed hand on the activation panel, ready to press the large, inviting button that would signal their victory. And then he stopped. Zorlax floated closer, its analytical hum faltering for the first time in a month. The beacon wasn't just off. It wasn't dormant. It was destroyed. The spire was bent at a sickening angle, as if a god had tried to fold it in half. The activation panel was a spiderweb of cracks, the button itself a concave depression of shattered crystal. Deep, gouging marks, far larger and deeper than anything Kthar's claws could produce, were raked across its surface. It looked less like a piece of sophisticated technology and more like a chew toy for something of incomprehensible size and anger. Silence descended upon the crater. A heavy, profound silence, broken only by the whistling of the alien wind. Kthar, The mighty Xyloc warrior who had bested every beast this planet could throw at him, stared at the wreckage. His mandibles worked silently, a sign of deep distress in his species. His entire worldview was predicated on overcoming challenges through direct, overwhelming force. But this was not a challenge. This was a statement. Something on this planet had seen a piece of advanced galactic technology and had, for reasons unknown, casually annihilated it. Zorlax began to flicker. The steady blue glow of its crystalline form pulsed erratically, shifting to a sickly violet. Its internal processors were screaming. All of its calculations, all of its carefully laid plans, had been predicated on a single, inviolable axiom. The beacon would be functional. The data was flawed. The conclusion was inescapable. They were not at the end of a test. They were at the beginning of an entirely new, and quite possibly terminal, problem. Probability of accidental structural failure due to seismic activity, 0.0012%. It resonated, its tone thin and reedy, like a deflating balloon. Probability of meteoritic impact, 0.0005%. Probability of destruction by an indigenous biological entity, uncomfortably high. Panic, a messy and illogical emotion the Glim had evolved beyond millennia ago, began to seep into its core matrix. They were stranded. Their 30-day supply of emergency rations had been consumed. Their energy levels were optimized for the planned extraction, not for an indefinite stay. The neat, orderly equation of their survival had just been smashed to pieces by an unknown variable. Thar took a step back from the broken beacon, his warrior's bravado finally cracking. He had seen the beasts of this world. He had fought them, killed them, eaten them. He knew what they could do. But the force required to do this to reinforced hyperalloy, it was beyond his experience. For the first time, he felt a sliver of something cold and unfamiliar slide down his thorax. It was fear. "We must establish a defensive perimeter," he growled, the sound lacking its usual commanding timbre. "We will fortify this position and await rescue. They will realize our beacon has not activated. They will come. The Academy protocol is clear," Zorlax countered, its light flickering more rapidly. "No intervention until the 30-day window has passed and the beacon is activated. They will not begin searching for at least another cycle. We are designated as lost only after 35 days. Statistical probability of a passing freighter detecting our life signs in this unsurveyed sector is," Zorlax paused, the silence more damning than any number. "Negligible." And that's when they both realized they had forgotten about the human. Jake had not roared in frustration. He had not flickered in panic. He had walked calmly up to the ruined beacon, knelt down, and was now poking at the wreckage with a stick, the same way he'd been poking at the soil for the past month. He scraped away some of the dust, ran a finger along one of the deep gouges, and then looked up at the two paragons of galactic superiority who were currently having a silent, existential meltdown. "Well, that's a pickle," he said, his voice entirely too cheerful for the situation. He stood up, brushing dust from his knees. "Looks like the pickup's been delayed. Anyone hungry?" Before either of them could formulate a response, Jake turned and started walking back the way they came, his stride unhurried. "Where are you going, human?" Thar demanded, his frustration boiling over. "We must secure this area." Jake glanced over his shoulder. "This crater's a bit of a kill box, don't you think? No water, no cover. Not a great spot to set up camp. There was a decent stream a few clicks back. Better soil, too." He said the word soil with a strange, appraising tone that made no sense. What did soil have to do with anything? "The logic is flawed," Zorlax hummed weakly. "Proximity to the last known coordinates is paramount for any potential rescue attempt." "Yeah, maybe," Jake shrugged. "But you can't drink coordinates. I'm gonna go find a good spot by the water. You guys are welcome to join when you're done freaking out." And with that, he disappeared over the ridge, leaving Thar and Zorlax alone with the monument to their shattered hopes. The two most capable survivalists their species had to offer stood in stunned silence, completely and utterly out of their depth. The soft, squishy primate, on the other hand, was apparently going to look for better dirt. The days that followed were a slow, grinding descent into misery for the two non-human cadets. Thar, driven by a primal need to act, attempted to hunt. But his usual bravado was gone, replaced by a grim, desperate hunger. The creatures of Xylos Beta, perhaps sensing his desperation, seemed faster, smarter, and more venomous than before. His hunts yielded less and less, and he began to lose the formidable muscle mass that defined him. His magnificent obsidian carapace grew dull, coated in a film of dust and despair. Zorlax entered a state of extreme energy conservation. It found a shaded overhang and remained there, immobile, its light dimmed to a barely perceptible glow. It spent its waking moments running endless, recursive simulations. It calculated the decay rate of their orbital path. It modeled solar flare activity. It composed and broadcasted complex mathematical proofs on all subspace frequencies in the desperate hope that some other intelligence might recognize the signal. It was, in effect, trying to think its way out of starvation, a strategy that proved remarkably ineffective. Jake, meanwhile, was busy. They saw him only fleetingly. He had, as promised, set up a small camp near the stream they had passed on day 28. He seemed to have an endless list of tasks. He spent 2 days just clearing a small, sunlit patch of land near the water. He used a sharp-edged rock he'd found, working with a steady, rhythmic pace that was neither hurried nor lazy. Thar watched him from a distance once, hidden in the rocks, and was baffled. The human was engaged in manual labor, a pointless expenditure of energy. He wasn't hunting. He wasn't fortifying. He was gardening. It was absurd. Then Jake started building a fence. It was a crude thing, woven from the flexible branches of a nearby thorn bush, but it was surprisingly sturdy. He was protecting his little patch of cleared dirt. Protecting it from what? Thar had scanned the area. There were no burrowing creatures large enough to be a threat. The most confusing part was Jake's demeanor. He wasn't desperate. He wasn't even tense. He often hummed a tuneless, cheerful melody as he worked. He seemed, to all external observation, perfectly content. He was still eating, too. They'd see him chewing on roots he'd dug up or leaves he'd plucked from specific bushes. Zorlax had scanned one of the roots from a distance, and its analysis came back as predominantly starch, trace minerals, non-toxic. The human wasn't just surviving. He was foraging with an unnerving degree of success. On day 40, a full 10 days after their scheduled pickup, Thar's pride finally broke. He had not eaten in 3 days. His powerful body was racked with hunger pangs. He found Jake by the stream, patiently sharpening a long, straight stick with a small, flat stone. "Human," Thar began, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. He hated the word, hated the weakness he was about to display. "I require sustenance." Jake looked up from his work. He didn't mock. He didn't gloat. He just nodded. "Yeah, figured you might be getting peckish. Hang on." He walked over to his campfire, which was banked and smoldering gently. He used his newly sharpened stick to dig into the coals and pulled out several blackened lumps. He cracked one open with the stone. Inside, the flesh was white and steaming. He offered it to Kthar. "Baked tuber," he said. "Careful, it's hot. Tastes a bit like a potato if you squint." Kthar stared at the offering. It was a plant, a root, the food of prey animals. But the smell was intoxicating. He took it in his massive claw, his movements clumsy. He brought it to his mandibles and bit down. The taste was incredible. It was warm and soft and filling. It was the best thing he had ever eaten. He devoured it in seconds and looked at Jake, 1,000 questions in his eyes, none of which he knew how to ask. Jake just smiled and handed him another one. Plenty more where that came from. It was day 45 when Kthar finally led Zorlax to Jake's camp. The glim was in a critical state. Its light was a faint, pathetic pulse. Its gravitic field was failing, causing it to bob and drift erratically. It was on the verge of permanent shutdown. "The human has resources," Kthar had explained, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. Zorlax had emitted a weak pulse of disbelief, but it followed. The logic was simple. Kthar was alive and looked better fed than he had in weeks. The source of this anomaly must be investigated. When they arrived at the stream, Jake was nowhere to be seen. But his camp was there. And it was not the temporary, desperate shelter of a stranded survivor. It was something else entirely. The first thing they noticed was the fence. It was now taller and more robust, enclosing a rectangular area about 20 meters long by 10 meters wide. But it was what was inside the fence that caused both Kthar's mandibles and Zorlax's entire crystalline structure to go slack with utter shock. The dirt was not just dirt anymore. It was organized. It was arranged in neat, perfectly straight rows. And in those rows, tiny green shoots were pushing their way up toward the bruised purple sky. Hundreds of them. But that wasn't all. A thin channel, painstakingly dug from the stream bank, ran along the top of the enclosure. Smaller, secondary channels branched off, snaking between the rows of green shoots, providing a steady, gentle flow of water. Jake had not just cleared a patch of land. He had built a fully irrigated, fully functional farm. Kthar walked the perimeter of the fence as if in a trance. He was a warrior, a hunter. Nature was an adversary to be fought, to be conquered, to be wrestled into submission. The idea of cooperating with it, of nurturing it, of patiently coaxing sustenance from the very soil, it was a concept so alien to his Xyloc mind that he could barely process it. He had spent the last 15 days fighting the planet for scraps. The human had spent the last 15 days convincing the planet to make him a meal. Zorlax floated over the small field, its dim light flickering as it scanned the scene. Its processors, starved of energy, struggled to categorize what it was seeing. This wasn't survival. Survival was a state of temporary endurance. This was infrastructure. This was long-term planning. This was an act of audacious, terrifying optimism. The human had not assumed rescue was coming in a day or two. He had looked at their situation, assessed the indefinite time frame, and his first thought had been to establish agriculture. A low, resonant hum began to build within Zorlax, a sound of pure, unadulterated cognitive dissonance. This soft-skinned, fragile creature, this joke of a species, had not only failed to die, but had actively begun to terraform his surroundings. He was not waiting for rescue. He was putting down roots. Just then, Jake appeared from around a bend in the stream. He was muddy to the elbows and was carrying a large, makeshift basket woven from reeds. The basket was full of the aforementioned tubers. He saw his two companions staring, dumbfounded, at his garden. He broke into a wide grin. "Hey guys, just in time," he called out, his voice echoing in the stunned silence. "The first crop of these little tuber things is coming in. Want some? I think I've finally figured out how to mash them." That evening, huddled around the humans' impossibly warm and steady fire, the three of them ate. For Kthar and Zorlax, it was the first full meal they'd had in over 2 weeks. Jake had roasted the tubers and mashed them with some edible berries he'd found, creating a strange, purple paste that was surprisingly delicious. As they ate, Zorlax, its energy levels partially restored, finally managed to ask the question that had been consuming it. Why? It resonated, the single word carrying the weight of 15 days of confusion and existential dread. Your species is not known for this. Your biological profile suggests a scavenger predator. This methodical cultivation is not in your file. Jake finished a mouthful of purple paste and wiped his mouth on the back of his hand. He looked at his little garden, the rows of green shoots barely visible in the firelight. "Oh, this," he said, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. "This is Plan A. Well, technically Plan B. Plan A is usually finding a convenience store." Kthar grunted, a sound of confusion. "Hunting is the primary method. It is the way of the strong." "Sure, hunting's great," Jake agreed easily. "I love a good barbecue, but it's inefficient. You spend all day chasing after your food, and some days, the food runs faster than you. We figured that out a long time ago. Back on Earth. Oh, I don't know, about 12,000 years ago, we got tired of chasing mammoths." He leaned back, propping himself up on his elbows and staring at the alien stars. The monologue that followed was not a boast. It was delivered in the casual, offhand tone of a teacher explaining a simple concept to a class of kindergartners. "See, you guys look at my planet, Earth, on the galactic charts and you see Class 7 Death World. And you're not wrong. Everything on Earth is trying to kill everything else in the most creative way possible. We've got tiny insects that can shut down your nervous system, big cats that hunt you from trees, and fish with more teeth than a politician has excuses. We have bacteria that can eat metal and weather that can level cities. You think the claw beasts on this planet are bad? On Earth, we have something called a grizzly bear. It's a 200-kilo ball of fur, teeth, and rage that can outrun our best athletes, and we take pictures of them for fun. We put them in our children's stories. He paused, letting that sink in. Thar tried to imagine a predator that inspired affection instead of terror and failed. Zorlax was busy cross-referencing grizzly bear with its galactic zoology database and was coming up with nothing but error messages. So, when you live on a planet that's actively trying to murder you 24/7, you learn to adapt, Jake continued. And our big adaptation wasn't claws or venom. It was this. He tapped his temple. We learned to think long-term. When the hunting got tough, we didn't just hunt harder. That's a sucker's game. That's how you go extinct. No, we changed the rules of the game entirely. He gestured with a half-eaten tuber towards his garden. We stopped chasing the food, and we started telling it where to grow. We called it the Neolithic Revolution. Agriculture. It's the single most important thing our species ever did. It's why there are billions of us instead of a few million scraggly hunter-gatherers. We didn't just survive our death world. We tamed it. We bent it to our will. We looked at a planet full of things that wanted to eat us, and we said, no, thank you. We'd rather have bread. Zorlax's facets glowed brightly. You domesticated your planet. Pretty much, Jake said with a shrug. We're still working on the weather, but we'll get there. The point is, for humanity, this, he waved a hand at the garden again, isn't some desperate, last-ditch survival tactic. This is just Tuesday. When I saw that broken beacon, my first thought wasn't, oh no, we're stranded. It was, okay, looks like I'm staying a while. Better get a garden started so I have something to eat. Honestly, I was getting a little bored just walking. This gave me a project. Thar stared at the human. He had spent his life training to be a weapon, to be the apex of a hostile universe. He had viewed Jake as a fragile, pathetic creature, a burden. He now understood that he had been looking at things entirely backward. He had been playing checkers while the human was playing a game so advanced he couldn't even see the board. Thar had been trying to survive the planet. Jake had been treating it like an unruly backyard in need of some landscaping. Zorlax resonated a new tone, one that had not been in its emotional vocabulary before. It was a frequency of profound, humbling awe. The Glim had always viewed humanity as chaotic, illogical, and primitive. It now saw that what it had mistaken for chaos was an unparalleled adaptability. What it had seen as illogical was a pragmatism that transcended simple calculation. They were not primitive. They were post-apocalyptic, a species that had already survived the worst their own world could throw at them and had come out the other side with a shovel and a can-do attitude. So your entire species, Zorlax began, its voice wavering, is capable of this. Jake chuckled. Me? Nah. I'm just a hobbyist. My grandfather was a farmer. You should see what the real professionals can do. They can grow crops in deserts, on the sides of mountains, in space stations. Give a human a patch of dirt and a little water, and he'll give you a civilization. He finished his tuber, stood up, and stretched. Anyway, I'm turning in. Gotta get up early tomorrow to dig another irrigation ditch. Big debt. He left them there, by the fire, and retired to the small, waterproof shelter he had woven for himself out of broadleaf plants. Thar and Zorlax sat in silence for a long time, the crackling of the fire the only sound. They were no longer cadets in a survival exercise. They were students in a classroom where the lesson was far more terrifying than they could have ever imagined. On day 62, a rescue ship finally descended from the bruised purple sky. The Academy had, after much bureaucratic delay, finally listed the cadets as missing and sent a search party. The rescuers, a squad of heavily armed Krill Marines, landed near the beacon's last known coordinates. They found the wreckage, and then they followed the tracks. They found the camp by the stream. What they saw made them halt their advance and call for their captain. They found a Xyloc warrior, one of the fiercest species in the galaxy, sitting quietly by a fire, patiently weaving a basket out of reeds. They found a Glim, a being of pure logic, humming a soft, melodic tune while it polished a row of smooth river stones. And they found a human, covered in mud, arguing with them both about the proper spacing for a new row of what he was calling alien beings. The camp was not a scene of desperation. It was idyllic. The small farm was thriving. A rudimentary dam had been built in the stream to create a pool where several species of small, edible aquatic creatures were now trapped. A clay pot, fired in the campfire, was bubbling away with a fragrant stew. When the rescuers identified themselves, Jake's first reaction was not relief. It was annoyance. "You can't be here yet," he said, gesturing at his field. "The bean things haven't even flowered. I was going to try crossbreeding them with the tuber vines." The debriefing back at the academy was a somber affair. The commandant, a grizzled old veteran with scars that told stories of a dozen different wars, sat across from Kthar and Zorlax. Jake was in a separate room, being gently but firmly interrogated by the Xenobotany department, who were far more interested in his bag of alien potatoes than his survival story. "Your report is unusual," the commandant said, tapping a claw on the datapad displaying their preliminary statements. "You claim that for the final 32 days, you subsisted entirely on cultivated vegetation provided by the human cadet." "That is correct," Kthar stated, his voice flat. "And that the human, Jake, single-handedly established a sustainable agricultural system using primitive tools in a hostile environment." "The logic is undeniable," Zorlax resonated softly. The commandant leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Cadets, I have been overseeing this examination for 50 cycles. I have seen species with regenerative abilities starve to death on Xylos Beta. I have seen silicon-based life forms get eaten by the rocks. No one lasts 62 days. And certainly no one comes back. Heavier than when they left, he glared pointedly at Kthar's now gleaming carapace. "So, I will ask you one more time," the commandant said, his voice low and dangerous. "What is the single most important survival tool a galactic operative can possess? Is it a blade? A shield? A superior intellect?" There was a long pause. Kthar and Zorlax looked at each other. They had shared an experience that had fundamentally rewired their understanding of the universe. They had looked into the abyss, and the abyss had offered them a roasted vegetable. It was Kthar, the great warrior, who finally answered. His voice was quiet, filled with a reverence that bordered on fear. "A shovel," he said. The commandant stared at him, utterly bewildered. Zorlax, sensing the commandant's confusion, offered a clarification. It hummed a complex, multi-layered frequency that the universal translator struggled with for a moment before spitting out the words. And a terrifying, incomprehensible patience. The commandant leaned back, utterly baffled. He dismissed them, and as they left his office, they could see a security feed on one of his monitors. It showed Jake, in the Xenobotany lab, enthusiastically trying to explain to a group of bewildered scientists how you could probably make vodka from his alien potatoes. From that day forward, the galactic file on humanity was amended. The entry for weaknesses, which listed soft-skinned, known natural weapons, individually fragile, was struck through. It was replaced by a single, cryptic, and altogether more terrifying sentence, added by a Glim analyst and a Xyloc warrior. "When faced with an apocalypse, they will plant a garden."